Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A meaningful Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, a Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, a joyous Israeli Independence Day to you all. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to our Out of Egypt program. My name is Meir Soloveitchik, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and expressing our gratitude to the supporters of this evening's event. First and foremost, to Emy Cohenca and to her children, Naveen and Philip, and to the entire Cohenca family for their enthusiastic support of this project from inception until this very moment. I myself had the privilege of sitting with Emy in her living room and looking at her wedding pictures and seeing her in that exquisite synagogue. And it's wonderful now to be here with you and your family here in our synagogue, marking your memories this evening. Also want to thank Gina and Felix of Blessed Memory, Harari and family, sponsoring in honor of Rabbi Shimon Aluf and in memory of Felix Turgaman. We thank the Shearith Israel League. We thank the American Sephardi Federation, especially their executive director, Jason Guberman, as well as Eddie Ashkenazi, who helped with the curating of the exhibits. We want to thank everyone who submitted their stories and photos that resulted in our beautiful commemorative booklet, and more copies of the booklet will be available for purchase following the event. Delighted to welcome Rabbi Albert Gabbai of our sister synagogue, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, who will take part in the panel later. And last but certainly not least, we want to express our gratitude to Zachariah Edinger, the visionary behind this entire program, without whom none of this would have happened this evening. Thank you so much, Zachariah. Before I begin my own brief remarks, I want to mark the meaning of the bridge in time in which we right now find ourselves. We stand as the sun sets between Israeli Memorial Day and Israeli Independence Day. And so, before our program, I will recite first a hashkabah for all those who died in defense of the Jewish state, followed by the prayer for the state of Israel that we recite here in the synagogue. Please rise. Tov Shemi Shemen Tov, V'yom HaMavet Miyom Yivaledo, Sof Davar Kol Nishmang, Et Limraton Tav Shimor, Ki Zeh Kol Ha'adam, Yalezu Chasidim B'chavod, Yiranu Al Mishkevotam, Menucha Nechona, B'Shiva Elyona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'Malot Kedoshim Utorim, Kezohar HaRakiyang, Meirim U'Mazirim, V'Chilut Tzamim V'Chaparat HaShamim, V'Archakat Peshang V'Akrahavat Yeshang, V'Chemla V'Chana V'Shochein Meona, V'Chula K'Hatava L'Chayei Ha'olam Haba, Sham Tehei Menatnu Mechitzar V'Yeshivat Nefesh, Hashem HaTov, Shel HaChayalim V'Hachayalot, Lochamei Eretz Yisrael, Giborei Medinat Yisrael, Maginei Am Yisrael, Shenaflu al Kiddush Hashem b'milchama, Ruach Adonai Tnichem b'gan Eden, Titpatru me'amal Adein kirot el Shmaya v'yara, HaMelech barach meichos v'yachmol aleihem, v'levehem hashalom, v'al mishpotem yeh shalom, ki dichtiv yavo shalom, Yanuchu al mishpotem aleich nechochohem, v'chol shochbei Am Yisrael b'chlal rachamim v'asilichot, v'chein yehi ratzon, v'nomar, Amen. Mi sheberach avoteinu, Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov, Moshe v'Aharon v'David u'Shlomo, hu yibarech et medinat Yisrael, et sarei et yoatzei et yosheveha, ve'et chayaleha melech, malchei hamelachim berachamav, yitakenei mitzvotav milifanav, v'yashrei al shochnei almat hakodesh, ruach dat v'yirat Adonai, sham chesed ve'emet, yipagashu l'chol b'nei adam ki malei haaretz, Teya et Adonai v'kayem banu mikra shekatuv, ki mitzion tete Torah, udvar Adonai mirushalayim, v'chein yehi ratzon, v'nomar, Amen. Please be seated. Let us imagine in our mind's eye the synagogue of the Jews of Alexandria in Egypt, which existed 2,000 years ago and is described in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. This synagogue, we are informed by the rabbis, was so vast, so filled with people, that those sitting in some parts of the enormous edifice could not see the chazan because they were too far away, and could not hear the words of the service because they were surrounded by so many worshipers. And so they had no idea when to respond at different parts of the prayers with Amen. Thus, we are further informed by the Talmud, the shamashim of the synagogue had to stand at various posts in the center and wave flags, large cloths, signaling the end of a blessing, so that all those assembled could answer in unison, Amen. This is one manifestation of the vibrancy that marked Egyptian Jewry. From that moment, from that synagogue in Alexandria, to the Jews of Egypt in the 20th century, and to their many beautiful synagogues, such as the one where Emy stood as a bride. Throughout the past 2 millennia, Egypt was marked not only as a center of Jews, but of Judaism. 1,000 years after the Jews of Alexandria first waved flags to signal Amen, a young man by the name of Moshe ben Maimonides, arrived in the Egyptian town of Fustat and authored there the most beloved legal code and the most influential philosophical work in Jewish history, the Mishneh Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim. Soon after the Spanish expulsion, David ben Solomon ibn Abi Zimra, known as Radbaz, became the rabbi in Cairo, and from there his halachic responsa went out throughout the Jewish world. Soon after that, a man with an Ashkenazi father and a Sephardi mother by the name of Isaac Luria, born in the Holy Land, came to study with his family in Egypt. He then sequestered himself on the banks of the Nile with the masterpiece of mysticism known as the Zohar, and emerged therefrom as the Ari HaKadosh, the greatest mystical master in Jewish history, from whom many Jewish traditions can now be traced. In law, in tradition, Jews who live all over the world today are impacted by the Judaism of Egypt. And this Judaism was not only one of rabbis, but of so many diverse individuals and families. We know about their lives because of the treasure trove from the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, known today as the Cairo Genizah. There one finds piyutim and poems of Judah Halevi, letters and legal guidance from Maimonides, but also a plethora of documents and letters from Jews of every kind, as well as countless ketubot, which testify over the centuries to the faithful families that were formed year after year in sanctity and in love. Solomon Schechter once famously described how he discovered in the Genizah all sorts of different papers stuck together from so many different types of Jews, rationalist Jews and mystical Jews, those who engaged in vibrant economic trades, and ascetics. Entering the Genizah, writes Schechter, one discovers there, quote, a battlefield of books and the literary production of many centuries. They sometimes afford curiously suggestive combinations, as, for instance, when you find a piece of some rationalistic work in which the very existence of either angels or devils is denied, clinging for its very life to an amulet. The last lines of the amulet, he continues, are then mounted on some IOU or lease, and this in turn is squeezed between the sheets of an old moralist who treats all attention to money affairs with indignation. Again, he continues, all these contradictory matters cleave tightly to some sheets from a very old Bible, and this indeed, he concludes, ought to be the last umpire between all of them, end quote. In other words, one encounters within these pages of the Genizah the love and the loyalty of centuries and centuries of Jewish life. Its extraordinary diversity, all bound together by one book, by the Bible, by the Torah, signifying that we are all members of the people of the book and all transmitters of the Jewish story. These are the Jews, the community that we celebrate tonight. And we do more than celebrate them, we remember them. The source for remembering the Exodus according to Maimonides is the biblical verse, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yatzatem miMitzrayim. Remember this day when you left Egypt. Jews again and again are commanded to remember, because through memory is how our past lives on. We mark this year at Shearith Israel as our year of years, 365 years of Jews in America. And throughout this year, we have focused on highlighting the extraordinary diversity of our own congregation and how the backgrounds of our members, their stories, formed us into becoming who we are today. We are, of course, on this evening, Israeli Independence Day, filled with gratitude to God for the miracle that is the Jewish state, a home and a haven for Jews. At the same time, to understand and face our future, we must cherish and transmit the past. It's my privilege to welcome you to an evening, not really of history, but of memory, in which the Jews of Egypt will live again. May we be inspired by these memories, cherish them as living legacies. And to this prayer, let us all, like the Jews of ancient Alexandria, answer, Amen. It's my great pleasure to now welcome to the table Emy Cohenca and her daughter Naveen for a conversation about Emy's memories of Egypt.
Hello, my name is Emy Cohenca. My mother, Emy Cohenca, was asked to reflect and speak about her memories growing up in Egypt, as well as the stories of her family's exodus. Speaking with my mother, organizing memories, we thought of sharing my mother's Out of Egypt story by reflecting on four questions. When and why did your family go into Egypt? What was it like growing up in Egypt? When and how did you leave Egypt? And where has life taken you from Egypt? So I will start by asking, I know your family moved to Egypt in 1934 when you were 2. Where did your family come from and what brought them to Egypt?
My father and mother were both born in Syria. But my father, Nissim, grew up in Peru, and my mother, Victoria, in Milan. I was born in Peru in 1932. When my parents moved in 1935, they could not settle in Italy because of Mussolini, fascism, and racial laws. My father went to look in Palestine and bought land in Tel Aviv, which we still own, but decided that if my mother didn't like Peru, then she would not like Palestine. So they decided on Egypt to pursue business and raise a family. Egypt was a crossroads at that time because it was open, very cosmopolitan, and had a large European community with Greek, Italian, French, and English people, and quite a big Jewish community whose impact was bigger than the numbers would indicate.
What was it like growing up in Egypt?
When we came to Egypt, we started out across from the temple on Rue Adli, and then my father found a beautiful apartment on Rue Beller, which was between the main two streets, Soliman Pasha and Kasr Nil. Our apartment was beautiful. My father would go out antique buying, and my mother never knew what was coming home. We had one room that was all Art Deco, one where that was all paneled, and my mother's bedroom was Chinese, with coromandel screens. Somehow it all fit in. Egyptian life revolved around food, meals, fashion, and outings. The pita bread in Cairo was nothing like the anemic pita bread served here. It was full of black beans with tamea, eggs, salad, baba ganoush, a real salad bar. We had every kind of nut, almonds, and pistachios in every dessert. People in Egypt were always sick because of the hygiene of the city. There was the Greek nurse Alec, who went around visiting many families, providing vitamin B12 shots in springtime, massaging, selling lotions, and making a very comfortable living. But of course there were cholera outbreaks treated with lemon juice and permanganate, typhoid, malaria, amoebas, and so many eye infections. It was not unusual to see babies in the street with flies in their eyes, and so many lepers who were part of the street scene. I was a pudgy child, and my mother a disciplinarian. She would have me exercise. So I would set out with my younger brother, Eddie, and I would skip rope while Eddie was held on a leash. On our way back, we would memorize a La Fontaine fable and recite it to my mother. We were surrounded by incredible culture at the time. Opera from Italy, Comédie Française from Paris, and the Old Vic from England, ballet, etc. We lived near a bookstore where the owner let me sit and read books for free, while Eddie, my brother, found a printing press where they allowed him to disassemble, then reassemble machinery. We lived in an Arab land, and Christmas had no part in our lives. My father, Nassim, was Orthodox and never touched anything Tarif in his whole life. My mother, Victoria, had gone to a Catholic school and was never observant. We went to English school but did not participate in Protestant prayers. Everyone was very tolerant. The society was segregated based on class distinction more than race or religion. Despite that, I learned a lot from my two lifelong friends, Susan and Fauzea. Susan was as English as can be, the daughter of an English headmistress living in Zamalek. She introduced me to Christmas, John Donne, Gilbert and Sullivan, and dogs, as none of my Jewish or Arab friends had ever owned pets. I still visit her on the Channel Islands. Fauzea was a granddaughter of Sedki Pasha, Prime Minister of Egypt, and with ties to the palace. Once she came to my house all excited, saying we were going to the palace to be introduced to the palace's life and norms. My father nixed that. No daughter of his was going there. I would and could only marry a Jew. Luckily, Jacques was a member of the Proveds, as we knew his family. Jacques' mother, Mrs. Cohenca, as I always addressed her, had a villa, and once she was blind, she entertained lavishly. Jacques' 4 sisters were contemporaries of my mother, and they had all played cards together for years, but she never saw me. Jacques was a loving son, and he built a home in Doki for his mother. You can see the silver and ivory trowel and spade that were used for laying the first foundations outside. And of course, a lamb was sacrificed and then distributed to the poor.
When and how did you leave Egypt?
My husband and I were engaged, and we knew one day we would have to leave Egypt. Tensions were mounting, and in 1945, the head of the Jewish community had a visit from the English ambassador, Sir Miles Lampson, who told him that when the English left, the Jews should also leave. Sure enough, once Israel became a state and the first Israeli-Arab war broke out in 1948, the colonels started confiscating properties, and they stopped giving work permits to Jews. It was very difficult to leave. A lot of people had no passports, but there were some very creative solutions. As the archives in Leghorn, Italy were burnt, passports were bought and issued with places of birth supposedly from Livorno. I got married at 18 in 1951. It was a lavish extravaganza. The ceremony at the Gates of Heaven synagogue or Temple Ismailia, with some 500 people attending and blind Rabbi Nahum officiating, it was somewhat sad. My sister Elsie was then 8 years old, crying when Jacques and I hugged her. I asked her why, and all she said was, "Because you're leaving." She was right, and life was for a long time unkind to her. At that point, many of the poorer Jews had gone to Israel, and the older, wealthier ones to Europe. The young ones were going to Brazil and Canada, or wherever there was an open gate. It was easy for me to immigrate to the US because I had been born in Lima, which had not filled its immigration quota yet. My parents, brothers, and sisters were not so lucky. While preparing to leave Egypt, Jacques and I sold everything that belonged to the Menashe and Cohenca families in our apartment. Never had it looked so beautiful. I will never forget the day one of my servants came to me and told me he had found someone to buy all our belongings. This was my very elegant black Nubian cook, whose face was scarred with 111, which identified him as a member of his tribe. Our upstairs neighbors had just moved out, and the man in their apartment was willing to take almost everything we owned. He came down to our apartment and would point at closets and say, "I'll take everything in there." It was very difficult for me to part with so many objects that had been collected with so much love, but there was no way for us to take everything with us. We left Egypt in 1956, not knowing when we would see our families again. Our son Philip was 4, and Naveen was 2. The Spanish consulate helped to ship our belongings and jewels to us in New York.
And last, where has life taken you since Egypt?
We moved to New Rochelle, which was serendipitous. Jacques was influenced by 3 friends we knew who told him that the suburbs were the place to be. He bought a house in the first week. Had he made a left turn, we would have been in Scarsdale. Unbeknownst to him, New Rochelle was a Jewish enclave. No Sephardics, and as foreign to us as we were to them, with our Italian nanny, our Oriental rugs, our myriad languages, each sentence always interspersed with 1 or 2 different language words. We were taken by the generosity with which our new neighbors treated us. We received a welcome wagon committee, and women from around the neighborhood came by to drop off cakes and introduce themselves. Houses and cars were never locked. I grocery shopped at my local Gristidis and was amazed at the amount and variety on the shelf, even finding Russian beluga caviar. Jacques started a business in New York and learned English while we raised our children in the suburbs. Of course, I never realized that in America, people did not have offices or apartments on the 13th floor because of superstition. It was 12A and 12B. Jacques' first office was cheaper because it was on the 13th floor. Then, too, Jacques found it was much easier to work in America. Another learning trait, you never repaired anything. Thus, if your iron died, you just replaced it. You did not mend or run in your hose, you threw it away. I was also shocked by the cavalier attitude Americans had towards teachers, but also saw that the children were taught to have a bank account, invest in stocks with imaginary money, and read the New York Times. I remember learning about Halloween, with the children going out and receiving loose candies before they had to worry about poison, and collecting for UNICEF. All these customs so foreign to us at the time. I would take my car and go to Columbia University to take classes, where I turned in handwritten assignments because I had never learned to type. Later, I went to the New School and took courses in art and did the rounds of galleries with an inspired guide and teacher, Estelle, who taught me what minimalism, expressionism, and arte povera were. That started me on my collecting journey. To this day, I go to lectures and gallery hopping with friends. Whereas in Egypt, cleanliness and health had always been problematic, American medicine helped extend Jacques' life. In 1962, my mother and sister were finally able to emigrate. My brother ended up studying at McGill University in Canada and then opening a branch of Jason Industry in California. Elsie studied interior design at Parsons. And Philip, my son, joined Jacques and grew the family business into a global company. In 1973, when our children finished college, Jacques, Victoria, and I moved to New York City and joined this congregation. If our faith was a common thread that shaped our lives, the family was a nexus of wealth in our lives. Today, I have 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Danielle, my firstborn granddaughter, told me, "My fondest and most vivid memories have always been around food and the dinner table. Every Passover, I would look forward to mamita," she called Victoria, grape leaves. It was amazing for me to watch her cook. She used no utensils but cooked with the senses, measuring by eye and taste. It's wonderful to think that these traditions that we worked so hard at first to preserve have their own lives, now in generations to come. I think of my way out of Egypt story as my Passover story. Looking back, being present, I feel very blessed. Dayenu, it would have been enough. Before ending, I would like to introduce my son, Philip, and let him speak 5 more minutes about his father. And please, let me extend, all my family is there, and let me extend my gratitude to all who shared this evening. Toda rabah and shalom aleichem, and in Egyptian Arabic, salam alaikum.
So how do you follow that up? My name is Philip. I'm the son of Emy and Jacques. I'm also the husband, father, brother, uncle, and cousin to many who are attending this wonderful event out of Egypt. I want to thank the rabbi and everyone at Shearith Israel that made this event possible. And a special thank you to my mother, Emy, and father, Jacques. For Emy, preparing for this evening was a time spent collecting and thinking back to another time, another way of life. The photographs and artifacts, some of which are presented in front of us, brought back memories and stories of laughs and tears. They represent the thread that binds and shared all of our lives and all of the family here, faith and family. Jacques, my father, was the patriarch of the family. Passed away 22 years ago, and having lived exactly half his life in Egypt and half in the United States. He was everybody's favorite. I had an incredible opportunity of working with him side by side for 20 years. He was demanding, giving, and always loving. There was always a kiss on my forehead when he arrived in the morning, and a kiss on my forehead when he left in the evening. Those are memories and feelings which I will never forget. And to be quite honest, they were embarrassing a little bit. You know, it was done in front of all the employees, and here he was kissing me on my forehead. All of us are so grateful that Dad got to know and love his 5 grandchildren, Philip and Andrew, daughter and son-in-laws. He left an indelible imprint on all our lives. I'm sure we also all regret that Jacques is not here for tonight's celebration, not here to play and love his great-grandchildren, Chloe and Leo, and those that are to come. From all of us, we love you, Dad. On that note, I want to thank our rabbi and all the staff at Shearith Israel for having made this event, and to all of you for showing up. I certainly didn't expect the size of this crowd, and it's quite exciting. And Mom, wonderful presentation, and I love you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You did hold my hand.
By all means. Can I help you up?
Thank you.
Anyway, I was going to speak to you today about what happened to me in Egypt, or what Egypt has done to me and my family. But why would I be kidding you? All of you in this room know all too well what happened to us in Egypt. You have your own stories, and though each story is... What are we doing? Oh, okay. Oh, I see, okay. You have your own stories, and though each story is inflected slightly differently, the end is invariably the same. They made life so difficult for us that after seizing everything we own, they either kicked us out or they made us understand that we needed to leave. This was not our land. Some left in the late 40s, most left in 1956-57, and those, like my family, stayed too long and were forced to leave in 1965. My friend, who's now no longer with us, Yves Salama, age 16 at the time, left in 1967 after serving time at the concentration camp of Abu Zabal in Egypt. Today, as is rumored, there are 3 Jews left in Alexandria, a handful in Cairo. I've spoken many times about how difficult life had become for Jews. We know the story. I've spoken about what it means to have everything you've owned to be taken from you. We know that story too. Ours is a sort of tired story. It's almost 60 years old. It needs to be retold, but many of us, children of parents who were never able to put back their lives together again, have written many books on the subject. We know that story too. Let's try to turn the page. When I look back, I remember wanting to leave. In fact, I think that's all I remember. I remember not liking life as the only Jew in a school, not liking being made fun of, or to feel that I didn't belong, and ultimately feeling that really, indeed, I didn't want to belong and couldn't belong to the new Egypt. So I did want to get out. But I didn't want to leave permanently. I wanted to seek out Europe, but the way so many of my Christian friends did in those years, to leave for the summer or for a few years and come back to life as we knew it. I bet that no Jew leaving Germany thought they'd leave forever. They'd leave, sit out the mad furor, and come back to life as they knew it. Life as we knew it. Those are the magic words. This is what is so hard to define. Everything else is quantifiable. The losses, even the abuse, the offenses, the humiliations, the beatings, interrogations, and yes, the in-your-face larceny. We heard an example of it. When you sell your stuff, they buy everything and they give you the cash on the spot. But life as we knew it is really an unquantifiable concept. It was a particular way of being with oneself, of being with others, of being with the world, and of course with the city, in my case, Alexandria. Allow me to embroider for a moment. Everyone was so informal. The word in French is liant. As a very young man, you'd be introduced by your parents to someone to whom you needed to show respect, but the tendency within minutes was to become informal. My father, who was a mass of contradictions, would always remind me to stand straight, look someone in the face when introduced, and please, ne sois pas baladé. For those of you who know the expression, exactly what it is. But my father was also someone who not only enjoyed the good things of life, a zibib at night, a cigarette here and there, the beaches, racquetball at the beaches, and yes, beautiful women too. But he did something that no one I know did except in Egypt. It's not only enough to enjoy zibib or a cigarette on a lovely summer night. The important thing was to tell someone to say that this was a pleasure. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a pleasure. You needed to say, ça c'est un mazag. Those of you who understand, you know what I'm saying. Okay. If you didn't say, this is a mazag, you weren't living. The word captures the plenitude of our life as we knew it then. The world has become a difficult place. Sometimes when I take a taxi and can right away tell when the driver, by his smile alone, is from Egypt, what's the most natural thing to do in the world than to go straight to the heart of things? أنت مولود في مصر ولا في الإسكندرية? But that's no longer really possible because it invokes so many political monsters. And yet I love the instant connection when I'm buying a pizza at Sal and Carmine on the Upper West Side, and the man making pizza is clearly from Egypt, so I blurt out, أنا اسكندراني, and he replies, أحسن ناس. So I'm clearly Baladi, as you can see. My publisher in Egypt promises to bring me back when my book is out. Lovely. But will he give me back life as I knew it? No. The Egyptian ambassador called me about a month ago, repeating the new promise of President al-Sisi, we want you back, we will rebuild the temples. Apologies, I don't go to temples. But if you give me back my life as I knew it, I'm back. Life as I knew it is not even about property, about money, about things, though you need them, of course, but it's about the color of life, and that is lost. And sometimes I think that what was taken away was the color of life. We all found ways to add color to life, but the color of sunset in Alexandria was not red, not orange, not pink. It was, for those of you who remember, tangerine. And that color you won't find anywhere else in the world. A week ago, I wrote to my only friend in Egypt and asked her if she could explain to me a new song that I've been hearing on YouTube. She sent me the lyrics in translation, although I could understand them. But I told her that I kept listening to the song again and again and again, and she answered this in another email saying, the reason, and I'm quoting her, the reason you can't stop listening is because dammak werohak Masri. Your blood and your heart or soul is Egyptian. I read her email in the subway. When I read this very same email this afternoon, I burst out crying. She told me something I didn't know, that I am, whether I like it or not, whether I forgive or not, I am still Mosseri. Thank you.
And now a slideshow of the synagogues of Egypt, presented by Jason Guberman of the American Sephardi Federation and Eddie Ashkenazi, research coordinator of the Diarna Geo Museum.
Welcome to the Diarna Geo Museum. Diarna means our homes in Judeo-Arabic. It testifies to a shared history which the forces of nature are actively seeking to erase by spreading ignorance and destruction across the region. In 2014, after seizing Mosul, Islamic State fighters made a public spectacle of destroying the tomb of Jonah. Across the region, Christians and other minorities are subject to the same persecution once reserved for Jewish communities. The threat against our common cultural heritage is unprecedented. We are in a race against time. Diarna is leading an effort to preserve the history of once vibrant communities. Every day, synagogues, schools, and community buildings that defined Jewish life across the Middle East and North Africa are decaying or being destroyed. this beautiful synagogue in Damascus. It is known as the site where the prophet Elijah anointed his successor. This was in 2010. This is now. Thanks to Diarna's efforts to capture the images, the artifacts, and the oral histories, over 1,200 sites have been identified and are now accessible online. Diarna is the first geo-museum of its kind. With the help of volunteers from across the region, including Arabs, Persians, and Kurds, as well as people of all religious backgrounds, an intense effort is underway to capture visual and oral histories before it is too late. In order to follow developments in real time, Diarna has set up a situation room to oversee digital mapping, traditional research, and field expeditions that cross into conflict zones to document the remnants of our shared cultural heritage. Here, in northern Iraq, we are rediscovering an entire Jewish village. The local elders remember the names of the families that lived there. Here, we see what remains of the synagogue in Accra. And in Saudi Arabia, we discover a complex of forts belonging to an ancient Jewish tribe which played a pivotal role in early Islamic history. Deep in the labyrinths of Saddam, Yemen, we document the vestiges of Jewish presence despite the chaos of an ongoing civil war. In other countries, peaceful environments allow us to render the full beauty of preserved sites. Witness the striking elegance of the Haile Pinto Synagogue in Essaouira, Morocco. This is heritage worth preserving. At a time when extremists are on a rampage to destroy the past and spread ignorance, the Diarna Geo Museum is on a mission to preserve, protect, archive, and project the knowledge, the history, and the cultures which together form our identity.
Good evening. I'm Edy Ashkenazi.
I'm Jason Guberman, and as the rabbi said, we're both from Diarna. I wear two hats. I'm ASF's executive director. Diarna is a project that I helped launch now almost 11 years ago, and the two are independent, but we work together.
And we're here this evening to show you a little bit about what is left in Egypt, because that is what Diarna does. We're here to figure out, there was a community, the community is no longer. What about the tangible physical items that they left behind? So with your permission, and I thank the Kahal and Shearith Israel for the invitation to join you guys this evening, let's take a tour. This is an image of Cairo. And you can see where the Jews were concentrated based on the concentration of pins that are on the map. But we're actually going to go to a little pin way out over here, because if anybody knows immigration history, it's always in the dense populated areas where the rich people don't want to live anymore. It's always that they want to move to a new area, they want to move to the suburbs. And Cairo was no different. In the same way that Emy, you lived in Zamalek, others chose to live in Heliopolis. And so let's go to Heliopolis and check out one of the synagogues that was built there in the 1920s. Called Vitali Majar, this synagogue was a humongous structure, but also the foundation of this community that was built in the new suburb, because it had a school and an old age home adjacent to it. So this synagogue, named after the founder Vitali, of an Italian origin, is a humongous structure, and a little bit of its size is visible through these pictures. But take a look at the chandeliers. You could see the detail work and the wrought iron. Here's a view from the balcony. It looks about the size of this building. Here's a view from the Hechal, and we could see a ceiling that's at least 25 feet tall. That's a bunch of meters. They did meters in Egypt. I'm not actually sure of the conversion. But these pictures are not ancient pictures. These pictures are modern pictures from 2017. And these pictures are evidence of a country that, while the Jews are no longer, they have some ambivalent feelings about the Jewish history. They have some ambivalent feelings about the Jewish culture. They have a list of Jewish sites that they're preserving. So there's a little bit of hesitation amongst the government. Here's a look at the Hechal, and look at all the marble and tile work. And common to all synagogues around the world, tzedakah box. And here we have for the school, and there are 2 more slots. But not everybody could access this tzedakah box. You had to have the special key. But now let's go somewhere else. Let's go to Damanhur, up in the Nile Delta.
So, how many people are familiar with the Baba Saleh? Just by show of hands. So the Abu Hatzera family actually began in Syria. And the legend is that one of their ancestors took a magic carpet ride, Abu Hatzera. They ended up in Risani on the edge of the Sahara Desert in Morocco. And there, the Abir Yaakov, the patriarch of the family, built a following in this rugged environment and became known for his mystical writings. At an advanced age, he set off on a pilgrimage to Israel. But he only made it as far as Damanhur in northern Egypt, where he stayed a short while, long enough to become known as a wali or holy man for all the religious groups, and then he passed. For many years, as is the Moroccan tradition of the Hilula, the anniversary of his death was itself a pilgrimage. That changed due to the political events of the 20th century, until the Camp David Accords. In the wake of Camp David, once again, thousands of Jews would come to this small northern Egyptian town and celebrate the rabbi and his teachings. In more recent years, the last 10 years, that became harder and harder. There was a campaign led by the Muslim Brotherhood in collaboration with several other political parties to try to shut down this pilgrimage. Mubarak at the time would allow access, but only at the last minute and only to a small group, and would get an injunction. And eventually it was completely cut off when under terrorist threat. The pictures here previously, these pictures, are from a researcher that Diarna had go to Egypt, and he did not go at the time of the pilgrimage, which was the only time access was granted. He went not knowing that that was the case. And as soon as he came up to the shrine, was immediately surrounded by police and soldiers and taken for questioning. Thankfully, he was eventually, after hours of questioning, allowed back in, so he got the pictures, and then escorted back to Alexandria and then to Israel. Was not allowed to stay in the country much longer. The more recent pictures are actually from the last couple of years, 2008, when the site was restored, and this happened under the noses of everyone because the pilgrimage had been off. The pilgrimage had been banned. Jews are not allowed to go to the site, and yet this ended up getting restored. And these pictures are courtesy of the Muslim Brotherhood, or at least of a Brotherhood photographer. There is an effort now to make the site accessible again, and there's ongoing discussions with the Egyptian government about doing this, but as of now it remains off limits but fully restored.
So we do have a few minutes and time for one more. So we've covered Cairo, we've covered Damanhur, but we left out Alexandria. So we're actually not going to go to the synagogue that you referenced, Rabbi. We're going to go somewhere else. I hope you don't mind. But we're actually going to go to a synagogue called Temple Menashe, Temple Menesh, built in the late 19th century, but also in Alexandria. There it is with the little tablet icon. And this synagogue is on Egypt's list of Jewish, Coptic, and Islamic sites. So it's a protected site for the Egyptian government. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily restoring it like they are the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue, but it is on their radar. That also means it's a little more difficult to get into, unfortunately. But looking at the outside, here is the little square on the exterior courtyard. When you walk in, it's a large space, but as we could see, it's not necessarily taken care of 100%. Here's the long view looking from the entrance, from the hallway where you walk in towards the Hechal. We can see the wooden benches still there. We also can see the chandeliers, and we could also see the ladies' balcony. Here's the view from the ladies' balcony. Again, we're talking at a large structure. This was not a one-room Stiebel-type structure. This was not tight, cramped quarters that you would find in the traditional Jewish quarter, the Harat al-Yehud. This was a monumental edifice built by a well-to-do Egyptian community that they chose to beautify their synagogue and their worship of God in the same way that this congregation has done so. Here, looking at the Hechal from the Bima, and this would be the view of the rabbi as he would speak from the pulpit, looking at a congregation of people laid out in front of him. Unfortunately, those people are not there today, but the building is still there, and it will hopefully become part of Egypt's national conscience once again. Thank you.
Now delighted to introduce, to speak on glimpses of the Egyptian Jewish community in pre-modern times, Arnold Franklin, professor at Queens College, CUNY in New York. Professor Franklin received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and his doctorate from Near Eastern Studies in Princeton University. His focus and expertise is on Jewish history in the Arabic-speaking world, and is the author of This Noble House, Jewish Descendants of King David in the Islamic East. Professor Franklin.
I just want to echo the thanks to the Cohenca family and to the Harari family. This is a really wonderful evening, and it's
Talk with me, so you gotta blame me a little bit.
It's terrific to be able to participate. I also want to say thank you to Zachariah for organizing. Since most of tonight's program is going to focus on the modern period, Zachariah invited me to say a few words about the long pre-modern history of Egypt's Jewish community in order to provide some general background and also to highlight some of the enduring features of the community. What I want to share with you this evening are three impressions that emerge from the manuscripts from the Cairo Genizah, about which you've already heard a little bit. So we've started with the middle of the 20th century, we've moved to the beginning of the 20th century, the late 19th century, and now we're going to jump about 1,000 years back. I assume that most in this room are somewhat familiar with the Genizah, so I'll just describe it briefly. In short, it refers to a massive archive of material that was discovered in the second half of the 19th century. The majority of the records were found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, or Fustat, but smaller collections were discovered in other synagogues in the area, as well as in the Basatin Jewish cemetery. The contents of all of these collections are somewhat imprecisely called the Cairo Genizah. And I must say it's a great honor to be able to share the podium this evening with Jeffrey Mosseri, whose family has done so much to preserve those records for scholars and for posterity. One of the things that makes the Genizah so special is that it contains lots of everyday records, in addition to the various sacred texts you'd normally expect to find in a Genizah, things like Bible codices, prayer books, pages from the Talmud, etc. These everyday writings include things like personal letters, business contracts, memoranda submitted to the local Jewish court, and many different kinds of documents produced by officials of the Jewish community as they handled daily affairs. The Genizah records are most abundant for the 2.5 centuries between the years 1000 and 1250, meaning they give us a wonderful view of Cairo in all of its medieval splendor, a time when it was the sparkling new capital of the most powerful Middle Eastern empire and the economic hub of the Mediterranean basin. I should point out these 2.5 centuries also are the period of such great medieval Jewish luminaries as Maimonides, the Rambam, Yehuda Halevi, to mention only two of the most spectacular figures who passed through Egypt. So what do these documents reveal to us? The first thing I want to note is the importance of business. The Egyptian Jewish community, as reflected in the documents from the Cairo Genizah, was a community of traders. It's astounding how many of the documents relate in one way or another to trade and mercantile activity, from business partnership agreements to letters exchanged between merchants, to promissory notes that functioned like modern-day checks that could be carried in lieu of gold and silver and cashed at a remote location, to the lawsuits that resulted from the inevitable disagreements over the handling of purchases and sales. What's more, businessmen were the very backbone of the community. The leaders and scholars of the community were largely drawn from their ranks. A good illustration of the multifaceted role that merchants played is provided by Nahrai ben Nissim. Born in Tunisia in about the year 1025, Nahrai moved to Egypt, living for a time in Alexandria, and then ultimately settling in Cairo. He was a major international merchant. He was involved in the buying and selling of over 120 different types of goods across the Mediterranean. But the real focus of Nahrai's business was textiles. Flax, grown in Egypt, was packaged, shipped to Sicily and Tunisia for production, while finished silk was imported from Spain and from Sicily. But Nahrai was not just a businessman. He was also a scholar and a communal leader. As a young man, he had studied in the academy of Rabbi Nissim ben Yaakov ibn Shahin in Kairouan, his native Tunisia. Later, in Egypt, he served as a professional judge and was addressed with legal questions from across North Africa. He served as the head of one of Cairo's congregations and spearheaded efforts to protect orphans and to ransom captives. In serving in these multiple roles, Nahrai was in fact typical of the merchant elite that led Egypt's Jewish community. The second observation I'd like to make is that the Jewish community in Egypt was an international community. International traders like Nahrai spent substantial periods of time traveling. They sailed to all corners of the Mediterranean. They sailed to Yemen and to India. Their journeys brought an international flavor to the community. But Egypt was also a community of immigrants. Jews came from far away to settle in Egypt from all over, from Spain, from Tunisia, from Sicily, the land of Israel, Syria, Yemen, Iraq. They also came from Christian lands, from Italy, from the Byzantine Empire, from Christian Spain, and from France. And finally, the international nature of the community is reflected in its material culture. Objects from all over the world flooded the markets of Cairo and Alexandria. One of the best ways to see this are the many trousseau lists that were drawn up for young brides that list items coming from all over the world that were part of the regular household material culture of Jews in medieval Egypt. The third observation I'd like to make has to do with variety of practice. There were various forms of Judaism that were in practice in medieval Egypt. There was a kind of plurality of Judaism, one could say. The two most prominent forms of Judaism that we encounter are the Babylonian or the Iraqi form of Judaism, that form of rabbinic tradition that would ultimately prevail. But there was also a tradition that was common to the land of Israel, sometimes known as the Palestinian tradition, In fact, the synagogue where the Genizah was found was an adherent of this land of Israel Palestinian tradition, which varied in terms of various liturgical elements, in terms of various halachic elements. Every town had a Palestinian and a Babylonian congregation. But that's not it. Egypt was also home to a very large Karaite Jewish community, a community that did not adhere to rabbinic tradition at all, and yet very much considered itself part of the Jewish community. One of the most remarkable things to come out of the Cairo Genizah are mixed marriage ketubot, illustrating the marriage of Rabbinite Jews, Jews who followed rabbinic tradition, with Jews of the Karaite persuasion. And then one could also point to a very large pietistic, mystical strand of Judaism that develops in Egypt. The leading figure among this movement is the son of Moses Maimonides, Abraham Maimonides. This kind of kaleidoscopic picture of Jewish variety is truly remarkable in Egypt. And so each of these three elements, the importance of business, of traders, the importance of the international quality of the community, and the diversity of religious practice, each of these would change over time. Maimonides, in fact, would try to change the relations, the positive relations between rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews. Obviously, trade would change over time. Industry would change. And Egypt would be a land of immigrants, of Jews coming from different parts of the world. Each of these would change, and yet in some fundamental way, they each would, I think, remain prominent features of the Egyptian community over time. So I'll leave you with those three thoughts and turn the microphone over to the modern period again.
Our program will now conclude with brief presentations by our panelists, Jeffrey Mosseri, Lucienne Carasso Bulow, and then concluding with Rabbi Gabbai.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming to our stroll down memory lane. I was specifically asked to I was specifically asked to single out some vignettes of memory, and that is what I intend to do. I first want to thank the rabbi, the staff, and particularly Zach Edinger, who was responsible for every detail of this wonderful evening. Now, many people are amazed by all the languages spoken by people who come out of Egypt. And just to be clear, by the age of 4, if you were in Egypt and you didn't speak 4 languages, you were considered autistic. But they did take all those languages and mix them up, so we had a name for that. It was called Frarabish. French, Arabic, English, Italian, and more. After a brief historical background, I will be giving you a few vignettes of my recollections of Egypt. From Toledo until 1492, and Livorno after that, the Mosseri family was engaged in banking and commerce. In 1750, there were 3 Mosseri brothers. One stayed in Livorno, one went to Salonika, and the third, Nessim, went to Cairo. They financed trade throughout the Mediterranean for the Italian government. This probably explains why today I am both an Italian citizen and a banker. Additionally, my grandfather Joseph and his brother Eli financed the building of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1931. A Canadian friend of mine sent me an article saying that the Mosseri family wanted the hotel to be a 5-star kasher hotel. But the food was so bad in Israel at the time that the Mosseri family had the meals cooked every day in Cairo and shipped by train overnight to the King David Hotel. I was born on the 9th of November 1942 in Alexandria, in the house of Joseph Smuha, my grandfather, who built half of Alexandria and after whom it was named Smuha city as it is even today. At that time in 1942, things were very scary, with the German army having reached El Alamein just a few miles away. In fact, a detachment of German motorcycle troops actually reached Alexandria and were mopped up by the British. That date of November 9, 1942 was particularly significant, as that was the night that General Montgomery broke through the German-Italian lines of General Rommel, and by doing so, turned the tide of World War II. While in labor, my poor mother, Zichronah Livracha, could hear the thumping of the guns at El Alamein. It is said, and it happens to be true, that Egyptians are the most wonderful people. Good, kind, hospitable to a fault, thoughtful, welcoming, warm, liars, and thieves. All in one package. But you must understand that when they lie, most of the time, it's because they're telling you what they think you want to hear. One last Alexandria story. My father, Zichrono Livracha, was the biggest private banker in Egypt, and also number 3 on the Germans' list of Jews to hang in the marketplace when they took over. Every Monday morning, he would get on a train from Alexandria to Cairo to open the bank so that any Jewish client who wished to withdraw his money to escape could do so. The train passed within 16 miles of El Alamein, where the Germans were, but he went anyway every week. The Mosseri family lived in Cairo in a house whose picture you can see in the brochure that you received. And the only place where I have seen anything similar is in Newport, Rhode Island, if any of you have done the tour. As you will also see in your pamphlet, the Jews in Egypt were very tightly involved in Egyptian life at every level. My grandfather Jean was lady-in-waiting to the Sultana, and my uncle Nassim was legal counsel to the royal family. My great-grandfather Nassim was also instrumental in setting up the Tribunal Mixte, the first court of private international law ever, presided over by judges from the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He was also instrumental in allowing Solomon Schechter to take about 500,000 documents in crates from the Cairo Genizah in the Ben Ezra synagogue to Cambridge. My earliest memories were centered around 2 very special people, Osta Hussein, our family chauffeur, and Marietta, my grandmother's maid, who had been my father's nanny. Osta Hussein thought of me as another son. He had several of his own, and taught me about electricity, building model aeroplanes and model houses. We loved each other very much indeed. When I returned for the first time from boarding school in England, I was just 10. As I walked across the tarmac carrying my heavy bag, Hussein was the one who detached himself from the crowd awaiting us by the terminal building, ran to me, took me in his arms, and swore that he would never let them send me away again. He lost that battle. In our garden, my grandfather had built a little synagogue. The minyan came from the Haret El Yehud, or Jewish quarter, and we attended services every Shabbat and all holidays when we were in Cairo. I remember crossing the garden afterwards for a wonderful lunch of ful madammez and eggs, or a marvelous dish of hummus el hara, pureed chickpeas with slices of fried cheese and grilled eggplant on top. Delicious. My bar mitzvah took place in our little synagogue, in our very own little synagogue, and I remember that my father gave me the same talit and tefillin that he gave to 7 other boys from the Haret El Yehud, who also celebrated their bar mitzvahs with me. I also remember a special moment when Rabbi Nahum Effendi, Egypt's grand rabbi for many, many years, who had become blind, had me taken over to him to give me a special blessing. Very moving. King Farouk had become king of Egypt at his father's death at the age of 16, and in a very few years he had become fat and debauched. By 1948, he had spent most of the country's treasury and needed a distraction to focus people's attention abroad. I remember very clearly on the radio as Farouk and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem exhorted the Palestinians in the very new state of Israel to come out and return in the wake of the conquering armies to claim not only their property, but also that of the Jews in what had become Israel, although Farouk could not bring himself to utter that word. I remember the blackout during the war in 1948, and I asked my father, "What are those lights crossing the sky?" He explained that they were searchlights to alert the Egyptians of any attacking Israeli aircraft. "Don't worry," my father told me, "Israel only has one plane going back and forth between the front lines and the warehouse, and it was certainly not coming to Egypt." I remember the big radio in the study where all of us congregated to listen to Kol Israel and find out what was really happening. Until 1948, despite the rising presence of the Muslim Brotherhood, relations between Jews of Egypt and Egyptians were excellent. After the war, things changed. I remember in my class at my school, there was a boy named Jeffrey Mosseri. His family had been called Israel, but they thought that changing to Mosseri was less conspicuous. What a mistake. In Arabic class, the teacher singled us out. For those of you who understand Arabic, Enta Mosseri, itla barra. You Mosseri, get out. Well, as a result, Gillis and I became the champions of marbles in the school. I remember in 1950, the fire of Cairo, when all Jewish businesses were torched. My father and I watched it from the roof of our house, and we were lucky enough that the police was just able to stop the angry mob at the bridge leading to our side of the Nile. I remember Naguib taking over after the king was expelled, and Nasser taking over after 6 months later, putting Naguib under house arrest where he remained for many years. In 1952, I went to boarding school in England. In 1956, my parents and sisters returned to Egypt 3 days before Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And they could not move for close to a year. I would write diligently to my parents, would receive their letters, but many of mine never arrived. Naturally, my parents complained bitterly. And it was only very much later that the postman was apprehended, and it turned out that when he got tired of his route, he would simply dump the bags into the Nile and go home. I hope the fish enjoyed my letters. In 1986, I returned to Egypt for 4 days as the guest of Swissair. All the people I knew well had left by then, and it was hard to connect. I flagged down a cab in Giza and kept the driver for 4 days. We embarked on 3 missions: find Osta Hussein, find the Mosseri compound in the cemetery, and find my father's bank. We also, in the process, visited the Riyadh synagogue, one of the many built by my family, the Ben Ezra synagogue, and the Cairo Museum. My Aunt Helen told me that I would find Hussein in the last street across from the university. I duly went there, but no luck. I kept asking, but no one seemed to know him. I finally came across a makwagi, a man who ironed clothes for people. He would take a sip of water from a glass and from his mouth spray the clothes before applying the iron. Very effective.
Very healthy. Very hygienic.
When pressed, he asked me to describe Hussein. Was he small? Yes. Was his very dark skin? Yes. Was he very old? Yes. Oh, he said, I'm sorry, he died 3 weeks ago. So I gave up my search. On to the bank. I searched everywhere I remembered, but no luck. So I started to ask around if anyone remembered the bank. No one did. I then saw a sais nearby, a man who parked people's cars for them. I asked him if he knew of 2 banks belonging to one family. There are hundreds of banks here, he said. Which family? I said, Mosseri. He looked shocked. He put his hand up as if to block out my hair. My father was bald. He looked at me wide-eyed and said, is it possible? No, it's impossible. Are you the son of Hawaga Guido, Mr. Guido? I said, yes. Oh, he hugged me crying, saying what a wonderful man my father was, and he always parked my father's car for him and that he missed him terribly. He then took me to a street with a large hole in the ground where a building had stood and pointed. That's where your father's bank was. Very sad. Next, the trip to the cemetery. With thousands, if not millions of people living there, it was very difficult indeed to find anything out. But eventually we found the Mosseri compound. The guardian that we continued to pay until he died looked suspiciously at me and asked, who did I want to see? When I said Joseph Mosseri Bey, he asked why. When I told him he was my grandfather, he relaxed and smiled and said, "You must be Hawaga Guido's son. Your parents did not allow children in the cemetery, so I will have the honor to show you around and introduce you to your family." He certainly did that. Every member going back 200 years. It was one of the very few places in the very large Jewish cemetery which was not vandalized. He then took me to a corner of the compound and insisted that I put my hand into a hole in the ground. Of course I refused, thinking of all the snakes and scorpions I might encounter. He finally prevailed, and with my arm outstretched underground, I touched some paper and pulled out these pages, these few pages of a psalm book with the Hallel on them. I read from these pages at my daughter Amanda's bat mitzvah in this very room. I then said to him, "What a shame, it's a shame about Hussein." He replied, "Why?" I said, "Well, he apparently died 3 weeks ago." He laughed and said, "No, I had lunch with him yesterday." He brought over his grandson, who came in the car with us to the place where he said Hussein was. He was right. And my aunt was also right. It was the first street across from the university. It just depended on which direction you were coming. Then there he was in a spotless white galabia, sitting back in a deck chair, sunning himself. I approached with trepidation and said, "Osta Hussein?" That's all I said. He stiffened, looked straight at me, although he could not see because he was blind at that time, and said, "Is it possible? Is it true? Has my son returned?" He started to cry, struggled to stand up, and threw his arms around me. "You will stay here with me," he said, "and I will drive you around." I explained to him. I explained that I was staying in a hotel and I had a driver. He promptly attacked the driver, and when I had pulled him off, he again insisted that I should stay with him. I explained that I needed a telephone, so he pointed vaguely down the street and said triumphantly, "There's a telephone down there somewhere." I explained that I needed an international line, and he finally relented. But he came everywhere with us after that and insisted that his eldest son take time off so that they could drive me to the airport. I have one little last anecdote. When I was in Cairo in 1986, I went to visit my father's lawyer, a courtesy visit. As I arrived, a gentleman was leaving. "Did you see that man?" the lawyer said. "He's a German industrialist client of mine, and he wants to leave tomorrow." I pointed out that he had not yet signed the contract, and he replied, "Oh, I'm signing it tomorrow morning so I can leave in the evening." "What word did they use for tomorrow?" I asked. "Bukra?" "Yes," he said, "Bukra." "Cancel your flight," said the lawyer. "Do you know mañana?" "Of course I do," said the client. "Well, Bukra is the same as mañana without the sense of urgency."
Well, Jeff is a hard act to follow, I'm afraid. Well, what I was going to be talking about is about my life and my family, just to give a sense of how life was for a kind of middle-class family. And unlike Jeff, I was born 9 months after VE Day. So I'm a post-war baby. So,
Microphone.
You can hear? Oh. Well, my parents and I lived with my grandmother in a villa, and my grandmother was Sol Arditi, who was treated like a queen by her children, and because she was a widow at the age of 35 with 7 children, and the children were so worried that they would lose her because she got sick, that they would cater to her, and she would spend her days sitting in the salon, in the sitting room, and all the relatives would come to visit and pay respects in the afternoon. And on Saturdays, all my cousins would come, and we would have a Shabbat lunch. We weren't very religious, but we were getting together. And we spoke French, basically, especially my parents' generation and my generation. But grandmothers all spoke Judeo-Spanish, Ladino. So I would speak, especially with my paternal grandmother, who was a Spanish citizen, and who was born in Salonika, and only spoke Greek or Spanish. I would have to speak Spanish because my Greek was not very extensive. We talked about nationalities in Egypt. Well, everybody was trying to get different nationality, feeling that they would be protected by a foreign government. In my case, all my ancestors came from Spain and then from Salonika. And on my father's side, my grandfather had been given Spanish citizenship, so my grandmother had a passport, Spanish passport. But my grandfather did not register my father in the consulate in Alexandria, so all his life he fought to try to get Spanish citizenship, and finally was unable to do so and became Egyptian. So we, of course, were stripped of our Egyptian nationality by the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And I recently became a Spanish citizen as a revenge. So my parents basically grew up poor. Both fathers had died and early. So they worked very hard, and my uncles and my father started businesses in import-export and pharmaceuticals. And my father fell in love with the shipping business, and he became a ship agent representing a Spanish liner company, which also enhanced our ties to Spain. When I was growing up, the music I was hearing was flamenco. But of course, I also heard Ladino songs. So we had a very nice life in Egypt. We had servants, we had an easy time. We would go to the beach, to the clubs, to the movies, American movies, and also French and Italian in original language with subtitles. So it was very pleasant. And then we would go with my grandmother and my aunts on around 11 o'clock. We would go and have tea at places like the Mayfair, was across from the Mediterranean, or there was the Beau Rivage, which was a beautiful garden with goldfish and a pond. And it was a very pleasant type of life. Personally, I was not so happy. I didn't like the beach and was kind of bored with the club. So all I did was go to American movies, and I wanted to come to New York and marry Paul Newman. But then when I did come to New York, I went to see a play with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, his wife. It was called Baby Want a Kiss. It was a bad play, but anyway, I could see that they were in love, so I decided, nah, that's it. You know. Besides, he's too old for me. But then I went to Yale University, and I was a graduate student there, and there was the opening of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So a friend of mine said, oh, let's go, we'll see Paul Newman. I said, no, he's too old. But had I known about Robert Redford, though, I probably would have gone. Anyway, so in Alexandria, we had beautiful synagogues, several synagogues, and the most beautiful one was the temple Eliyahu Hanabi, which I don't think this movie covers. Eliyahu Hanabi. Yes. Well, you should make an addition, I think. Yeah, it's a gorgeous synagogue. apparently was built in the 19th century because it had burned down, and they had some Italian architects, and the columns, beautiful columns from, I think, Carrara marble. And they're huge and really very impressive. I went back in 2004, and they opened the synagogue for us, and I took some pictures. It was still impressive, although you could see that there was water damage. I understand they're going to be fixing it soon, sometime. But anyway, so we were doing very well. My father had the only Corvette in Alexandria, and I tended to be very late waking up to go to school, so he would zoom me with a Corvette to school, and I would make it. He was really speeding. First I started going to a Jewish private school, the Lycée de l'Union Juive pour l'Enseignement. And there we studied Hebrew, we had parties for Purim, we had plays. It was very Jewish, except November 1st, 1956, we had the Suez Canal crisis, and my world came tumbling down as many other people's world. And in school we were 60 in class, and by the end of the year we were about 6. Everybody started leaving. You would sit next to your best friend in school, and then the next day they weren't there anymore, and then you would ask, and they would tell you, oh, they left Egypt, because everybody was scared to tell other people that they were leaving because they were afraid to be denounced. So, what happened is that my father, my maternal uncle, Joseph de Botton, and my father were interned and taken to Cairo for kind of imprisoned for about 3 months. And by the time they came back, the businesses were taken away. My father's agency was taken away from him by his Muslim associate. And everything changed, and I ended up going to Catholic school. Now, in Catholic school, you could see how the curriculum had changed. The government, for instance, collected our books, French books, and when we got them back, we had Chanson de Roland, which is about a hero who was fighting the Saracens in Spain in the Middle Ages. That was taken out. There was a poem by Alfred de Vigny, Le Corps, which also talks about Roland, and that was also gone. And they chose all sorts of, anything that had to do with Jews or fights against the Muslims were gone. And we could fail French, but we could pass to the next grade. But if we failed Arabic, then we had to redo the grade. And my first year that I was in Catholic school, the teacher asked, who is a hero of the Egyptian revolution? So I said, Mohammed Naguib. The teacher said, Lucienne, who is the hero of the Egyptian revolution? So I said, well, Saad Zaghloul, he did a lot of things. No, Lucienne, who is? So finally I said, Gamal Abdel Nasser? Of course, yes. So I got 0 in history, 0 in geography, and 0 in civic instructions. And I was a rebel, something of a rebel. So. And in school, we had to march like soldiers and salute the flag. And that was in the Catholic school. Eventually, the French teachers came back, and then I went to the lycée, which was called by that time Al-Hurriya, which is liberty. And there we had to salute the flag again, and the Muslim girls would come with guns, and they would march, and we would have to march, and then we would have to salute the flag and sing Allahu Akbar. So there was, and the whole curriculum was geared to your telling, writing that how heroic the Egyptian army was, and how great the high dam of Aswan was. Anyway, it seems that I'm...
Got it. Here you go.
Sorry.
So here you go.
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm supposed to be winding down. So you probably saw downstairs a picture of kind of a confirmation. It looks like a confirmation with girls with white dresses. And that was my bat mitzvah in 1959. Well, like everybody, we had to leave, and we went to Italy, to Genoa, and then finally we got the visa to come here. And we landed here in September 1962, which was the time of the Bay of Pigs. And it was basically Yom Kippur, and my parents and I came to Shearith Israel. And so I have this tie to Shearith Israel since 1962. Thank you. On m'entendait pas?
Très bien. Tu fermes vite dans un temps. First, les rois d'Arsania. Thank you again. I want to repeat what Jeff said. We are grateful to the Rabbi, Mr. Zachariah Tinger, and all the staff of Shearith Israel of holding this wonderful evening of reminiscence, wonderful part of the Jewish history. In 1975, I hope the right day, Franco died in Spain, right? 1975, was it? Huh? 74, 75, something like that. And I was in the synagogue here, and I heard somebody who came in front of the Echal, the Minhaj, when they returned the Sefer Torah, and said, you have to say Hashkaba for the memory of Franco. And those who know who exactly it is, right? Of blessed memory. And I said to myself, wow, look at that. Very, very smart. There must be something in it. And you find out why. So let me tell you about a few things. I'm not going to repeat everything that everybody knows. People, how they spoke many languages, with a nice life before the war. Everybody knows these things and were easy. And our family, like many other families, as you know, there are no such thing as Egyptian Jews. There are Jews in Egypt. Most of the Jews came from different countries. Our father was born in Baghdad. Our mother comes from Italian family, Gallico. They met, like everybody else, they met in Egypt and they got married and they have children, etc. We were 10 children. Our father died in 1952 when we were all children, very, very young. But of course, we were very observant in our family, very observant. Shabbat, our father had a store that dealt with silk shirts and had outside the sign said Achim Gabbai in Hebrew and in French also, and Frère Gabbai, and everybody knew, oh, that's a store that in the corner of the street that closes on Shabbat, on Saturdays, right? It was a trademark. And so everybody knows the same story. We went to French school, we spoke French at home, and etc., etc. So I am going to tell you a little bit about modern times. Modern means recent times. And as you know, the horrible situation, just a small thing, when World War II started, the Jews in Egypt knew exactly what was going to happen, what was happening in Europe with the Jews. And they knew about the concentration camps and the death camps. And our father said that, you know what, if Rommel comes, we better get ready. So we started our passport. I was not yet born. A passport to go down in the middle of Africa to Sudan, all the way down. But thank God, Rommel didn't succeed, and Montgomery won. And so that episode passed. But at the time, there were many movies that were, for instance, German. So first of all, since the Jews were in control of the commerce at that time, they immediately stopped buying anything German. And even they put young people at the entrance to movies, and if they saw a Jew going into the movie, a German movie, so, how dare you come in? Out! And so it was really in solidarity with the rest of the world. A month ago, we celebrate Pesach. And in Pesach, in the Haggadah, it says, as Rambam says, in a slight different change, says, every Jew has to feel as if he himself or herself came out of Egypt. You have to feel it. You have to read it. So for us, no big deal. We know exactly. Sorry for the rest, You have to make the effort to feel that you came out of Egypt. Of course, for the recent times, the recent time is not happy. It's horrible. It's very bad. So, as you know, everybody was trying to leave Egypt as much as they could, and then came to get out of Egypt, you needed a visa. They will not let you get out. So if you heard about red tape, Italian red tape, as Jeffrey said, Bukra is nothing compared to Mañana. And here, Italian red tape is nothing to compare with Egyptian red tape. So you want to get out of the country. And they are happy to get you out, but on the other hand, they want to make life miserable. So you go and say, all right, I've got the papers. Oh, this birth certificate is missing. Oh, but you didn't tell me to bring the certificate. Come back again, wait online for 2 weeks, come back next month, etc., etc. It was very, very bad. But they want you to get out, but contradiction in the Middle East is very common. And at last, we were 10 in our family. 8 boys and 2 girls. And as I mentioned, our father of blessed memory passed away when we were children. So it was only our mother who had to take care of 10 children and manage the sword. So thank God, we were able to have 4 of our brothers to leave and come to the US in the early 60s. And we, the remaining, were about to leave in June 6, 1967, the war broke out. The government agents went everywhere where there were Jews and rounded them up. Everybody. Every man and boy was rounded up. And we were put in the concentration camps. We became 350 of us. And first, we were put through police stations, the beating, the humiliation, the beating, the horrible stuff. And then from there, taken to another concentration camp called Abu Zabal, there for 6 months, and horrible over there. And we were mistreated whenever there was something also coming out, for instance, in the field, in the war field. This means that every time that Israel would bomb something in Egypt, they would come and beat us. Why? Say, look what your brother and sister are doing to us. And so there's an Arab proverb, Arab saying, if you cannot control the donkey, then beat the saddle. And that's what we told them. And of course, they didn't like that saying. I said, it's your saying, it's not ours. And they beat us more. Okay. Anyway, after that, we were taken from that place to a place called Tura. And Tura, it's an old British-built prison camp. So we were our prison camp was in the middle, surrounded by the common criminal prisoners, and the whole thing in a military camp, and the whole thing in the desert. So if you are thinking about escaping, you have to go from your prison to the criminal prisoners camp, to the military camp, and to go to the desert, and maybe you make it. So there was no thought about escaping. So it was very, very difficult. Our mother didn't know where we were for the first 6 months, and that was really very difficult. Now, some people, as I mentioned before, had, and have you heard from everybody here, had different passports. Italian passport, Spanish passport, French passport, English, Greek, all, right? In 1920 or 25, something like that, I'm told that the Egyptian government said, all these Jews who came, let's say our father came from Baghdad at the turn of the century. How do you think they came from Baghdad to Egypt? You can figure out, maybe by camels, maybe by train. There was no borders, there was no things. He just came and just settled. So most of the Jews were stateless, apatride. And so in 1920s, the Egyptian government said, if you gain the Egyptian nationality, you'll get a lot of advantage in your commerce. So our father said, one nationality like any other nationality, why not? Let's take it, no problem. Our mother had the Italian nationality. So what happened when the 6 Day War came and they rounded up all the Jews? Those who had foreign nationalities, they had to let go, because the country that protect them, they're subject of, they claim them. They're our citizens, our subjects. You cannot do it. You have to let them go. And effectively they let go. So what was left in the prison camp? Those who were stateless, apatride, and those who had Egyptian nationality. So our mother said, okay, let's go to the Italian embassy and transfer my Italian citizenship to my children. And then we'll be out. And she goes to the Italian embassy and she said, please. And they said, you know what, madam, we are very sorry. In other circumstances, we would have done that. But now it's too sensitive. We cannot help you. She said to them, you know what? Do you think I would come to you in other circumstances? That's the answer. So, we were left for 3 years. But before that, we got the Egyptian newspaper in the camp. And of course, 90% of it, as Jeffrey said, lies, distortion, but you have to read in between the lines. There was an exchange of prisoners between Israel and Egypt. 5,000 officers of the Egyptian army, generals, colonels, everything. Exchanged for what? For the people of Robert Dassa and Marcel Nino, all these people who were in the Lavon affair situation in 1954, and 2 Israeli frogmen. And we said, we will be part of that exchange, no doubt. Guess what? Disappointment. Nothing. Why didn't Israel ask for us? All questions go through your mind. Or maybe if they insist, maybe the Egyptians are going to think that they have something of value. So that, who knows what goes through your mind? All right, nevertheless, we were there. What to do? After 3 years, we heard that the French minister plenipotentiaire who came to Egypt in 1970 and left. We heard that the Spanish ambassador spoke with Nasser and then left. 3 weeks later, we are told, you're leaving. Oh, great. They took us from the prison camps with handcuffs into the truck. The truck went to the airport, and still with handcuffs, they put us in the plane. Only on the plane they removed the handcuff. And we went to fly to Paris. From extreme confinement to extreme freedom. When he saw the hostess on the plane, I said, oh, that's a woman. Oh, yeah, very good. When I came here, it was in January, it was snowy. We waited for about a year to get our visa to come here, since we had already 4 brothers here, and so it was easy, they were citizens, so reunification of families, so we came here, and immediately got the green card to start working, of course, and that night that I arrived, it was an evening, it was night, and at Kennedy Airport, what is the melody that is going around in the airport? If I were a rich man. We had seen the play in French in Paris, and now he's in English. And so we, of course, we got together. When we were in Paris, the urge to go to Israel was very strong, extremely. And we told our family in New York, we're going to Israel. That's it. We suffered because we're Jews in Egypt, therefore we have to go to Israel. And our brothers in New York said, no, wait. You'll go to Israel, no problem. But first come here, make a bit of money, and then you go to Israel. You can go back and forth as much as you want. Of course, we came here, and the rest is story, right? And we never went to Israel, of course, to visit. 2 of my brothers went to Israel, and they stayed there in Aliyah. And then they came here, and then they came back. Anyway, I ended up here, and then I wanted to know desperately what happened. How were they let us go out? And I heard a story like that the Spanish ambassador went to Nasser and said to them, look, you have a lot of trouble. Many people, every time, at every press conference, they ask you, what about the Jews in Egypt? And you're not answering. You make up stories. Oh, they are spies. They are spies. Oh, we are going to take care of them. Oh, we're going to release them pretty soon. All kind of stories. And it's very bad reputation for Egypt. And if you let them out, the other countries, such as Syria or Iraq, is going to say, what? You are a traitor, Nasser. How dare you let the Jews out free? So I will give you a solution. These Jews that you have in Egypt, in the concentration camp, they are Spanish. We expelled them in 1492. We'll give them a Spanish passport to get out, and they are subject citizens when they get out. A passport good for 2 years, non-renewable. And that's the story from that port. And also the French give us a laissez-passer to get into France. But the most moving part of it, of course, is when I came here, my first synagogue was here, Shearith Israel. And then I heard that famous memorial prayer for Hashkava for Franco. And I made the connection between these two things. And I was at Yeshiva University as a student, and of course I wanted to know what happened during these 3 years of hell. What was the world out? What the Jews were doing? And of course discovered that almost every week there were demonstrations in front of the Egyptian delegation to the United Nations, saying, "Let the Jews out, let the Jews out." It was in front of the Egyptian delegation, the Syrian and the Iraqis. And then the feeling that I had was overwhelming, because I knew that we as a Jewish people support each other and we were not let down. And this is a very important message for me. And I want to end with this word. First of all, I will never, ever go back to Egypt, even feed me all the gold on this earth. Other people have the courage to go for different reasons. Also, they did not experience maybe as bad as a history that I'm telling you. But it taught us a lesson that is written in the Talmud, that the Jewish people is a body. If there is a limb that is hurting, the whole body is hurting. And we are all together on that thing. We, the Jewish people, must always support each other and continue. Without the support of each other, for each other, miracles could not happen. Thank God we are all here alive. Thank you very much.
Génial, bravo, bravo, vraiment.
I want to thank all of our presenters and panelists this evening. Andre Aciman, Professor Arnold Franklin, Jeffrey Mosseri, Lucienne Bulow, Rabbi Gabbai, Jeffrey Mosseri, and of course, Emy Cohenca and her children. We started this year series with Rabbi Gabbai. Now we have our Egypt program, and the Son result in many more programs highlighting the rich tapestry that is Israel. People can come closer and follow the conclusion of the program to view the display. You can purchase additional booklets. And because today is Yom HaAtzmaut, we'd like to conclude first with the content of the Omer and then singing Hatikva. Please rise if you'd like to follow along with the Omer, page 387 and then page 389. Please stay with me.
אשר קידישנו ספירת העומר היום 19 עומר שהם 6 שבועות 9 ימים הרחמן הזאת אמרה בימינו That's right. Li Adam Hoshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Li Adam Hoshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
Chag Sameach.
Very good. Your presentation was very good.
Yeah.